The steam from the cup of instant ramen fogged Elena's glasses, but she didn't bother to wipe them. She was too focused on the blue light of her laptop screen. It was 2 a.m. in their cramped Queens apartment, a space where the radiator hissed like a dying animal, and the scent of old wood and cheap laundry detergent lingered. Elena's fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't writing her own resume. She was rewriting Julian's final presentation for the partners at Sterling and Associates. The precedent from the 1994 Henderson case is the anchor, she whispered to herself, tucking a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear. If he leads with that, they can't say no. She had spent the last 3 years doing this. She worked 10-hour shifts as a junior paralegal at a mid-sized firm, then came home to be Julian's researcher, editor, and personal strategist. She had paid the rent while he finished law school. She had bought him his first tailored suit with the money she'd saved by skipping lunch for 6 months. She was the scaffolding that held his ambition high enough for the world to see. The door clicked open. Julian walked in, looking like a man who had already conquered the city. His coat was damp from the New York drizzle, but his face was glowing. "Julian!" Elena stood up, her legs stiff. "How did the final interview go? Did they give you the offer?" Julian didn't hug her. He didn't even take off his coat. He walked to the window, looking out at the skyline he so desperately wanted to own. "They didn't just give me the offer, Elena. They gave me the senior associate track, highest starting salary in the firm's history." Elena felt a surge of pride so intense it brought tears to her eyes. "We did it! All those late nights? We actually did it!" She moved toward him, reaching out to touch his arm. "I bought a bottle of cheap sparkling wine. It's in the fridge. I thought maybe we could finally talk about that trip to—" "I'm moving out tonight," Julian said. The words were flat, like a gavel hitting a block. Elena's hand froze in midair. "What? Tonight? We haven't even looked at apartments in the city yet. I mean, I know we talked about moving closer to the firm, but—" "Not we," Julian interrupted, finally turning to face her. His eyes, once warm and appreciative, were now as cold as the glass windows of a skyscraper. "I'm dating Vivienne Sterling," he said. He said it with a terrifying lack of guilt, as if he were announcing a change in a legal filing. "She's the daughter of the founding partner. She's the future, Elena." The room seemed to tilt. Elena reached for the edge of the desk to steady herself. Her fingers brushed against the very brief she had just finished perfecting for him. "Vivienne Sterling? You've met her 3 times. You told me she was icy and entitled." "She's a woman who matches the life I'm about to lead," he said, his voice rising with a defensive edge. "Look, Elena, you've been great, truly. I couldn't have made it through law school without your help. But we have to be realistic. You're a helper. You're the person who stays behind the scenes. I'm going to be a face of this city. I need a woman who matches my future, not my past." "Your past?" Elena's voice was a whisper. "Julian, I am your present. I'm the reason you have that offer in your pocket." "And I'll always be grateful," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a wad of cash. He set it on the table next to the ramen. "I've already called the landlord. The lease is in my name, and I've terminated it effective at the end of the month. You'll need to be out by Friday." He walked toward the bedroom, emerging minutes later with 2 high-end suitcases, the ones Elena had bought him for his birthday. He didn't look at the photos of them on the mantel. He didn't look at her. "You're a good person, Elena," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "You'll find someone who wants the quiet life you're suited for, but I'm meant for more." The door clicked shut. Elena stood in the silence of the empty apartment. The radiator gave one final violent hiss. She looked down at the desk. Her laptop was still open, the cursor blinking steadily at the end of the brilliant legal argument she had just written for him. She walked to the window and watched as a sleek black town car pulled away from the curb. In the back seat, she could see the silhouette of Julian, leaning back into the leather, already gone. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. Then she looked at the folder on the desk, the Julian Thorne file, containing every strategy, every note, and every win she had manufactured for him. A slow, cold heat rose in her chest. For 7 years, she had been the wind in his sails. She had forgotten that the wind doesn't need the boat to move. It just needs to decide which way to blow. She didn't cry. Instead, she reached for her laptop and began to type. But this time, she wasn't writing for Julian.
The new apartment was less of a home and more of a shoebox with a window that faced a brick wall. It smelled faintly of lemon bleach and the damp exhaust of the Chinatown bus stop 3 floors below. Elena sat on a folding chair, the only furniture she had besides a twin mattress, and stared at the cracked screen of her phone. She had exactly $400 in her savings account. Julian's generosity, the wad of cash for the rent, sat untouched in a drawer. She wouldn't use it. Using it felt like accepting a severance package for a heart she'd invested 7 years into. She opened her laptop. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she clicked into the cloud drive she had curated for years, the Thorne archive. It was thousands of pages of research, case summaries, and branding strategies. She scrolled through a folder titled Sterling and Associates, Vulnerabilities and Growth. "You think I was just a helper, Julian?" she whispered to the empty room. "You didn't even realize I was the architect." 2 weeks later, Elena stood in the lobby of Reed Capital. If Julian's new firm, Sterling and Associates, was old money and mahogany, Reed Capital was glass, steel, and aggressive innovation. Marcus Reed, the man who had famously snatched 3 major tech IPOs from under the Sterling's noses last year, was the only person Julian feared. Elena wasn't wearing a designer suit. She was wearing a thrifted charcoal blazer she'd tailored herself with a needle and thread, and her hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it made her cheekbones look like glass. "Mr. Reed doesn't see people without a referral," the receptionist said, her eyes barely lifting from her screen. "Tell him I have the internal strategy for the Sterling-Lockwood merger," Elena said. Her voice didn't tremble. "And tell him that Julian Thorne didn't write it. I did." 10 minutes later, she was in a corner office that overlooked Central Park. Marcus Reed didn't look like a shark. He looked like a scholar, rolled-up sleeves, silver-rimmed glasses, and a stack of physical books on his desk. He studied Elena for a long beat. "Mr. Julian Thorne is the new golden boy at Sterling," Marcus said, leaning back. "The talk of the town. They say he's a genius. Why are you telling me he's a fraud?" "He's not a fraud," replied Elena calmly. "He's a very talented actor. He can deliver a speech beautifully, but he doesn't know why the speech works. He doesn't see the patterns in the data. He doesn't know how to predict a rival's move 3 months in advance." She slid a thin tablet across his desk. "I do." Marcus looked at the data. His eyebrows shot up. "This is sophisticated. This isn't just legal work. This is predatory branding." He looked up at her, his gaze sharp. "What do you want, Miss Vance? A job as a paralegal? I want a seat at the table. I want to run your boutique consultancy wing. I want to take the clients the Sterlings think they own, and I want to show them why they should have been looking at the person behind the curtain instead of the man on the stage." Marcus Reed smiled, a slow, dangerous expression. "I like people with a chip on their shoulder, Elena. They work harder." The next 6 months were a blur of adrenaline and transformation. Under Marcus's mentorship, Elena didn't just work, she thrived. She shed her helper skin. She learned to speak with the authority of her own intelligence. She replaced her glasses with contacts and her hesitation with a sharp, calculated grace. The glow-up wasn't just about the sleek Italian silk dresses she could now afford, or the way her dark hair caught the light. It was the way she walked into a room. She was no longer the scaffolding, she was the monument. The turning point came at the Autumn Equinox Gala, the biggest event in the New York legal and financial world. Elena arrived on Marcus's arm, wearing a midnight blue gown that draped over her like liquid moonlight. The room was a sea of tuxedos and diamonds, but as they entered, the hum of conversation shifted. "Is that Elena?" The voice was familiar, but the tone was wrong. It was Julian. He was standing near the champagne fountain, looking every bit the high society lawyer in a bespoke tuxedo. Beside him was Vivienne Sterling, looking like a statue carved from ice in a pale silver dress. Julian's glass nearly slipped from his hand. He looked at Elena as if he were seeing a ghost or a goddess. The woman before him wasn't the tired ramen-eating girl from Queens. She was radiant, her eyes sparking with a cold, confident fire. "Julian," Elena said, her voice smooth as velvet. She didn't stop to linger. She simply nodded as she passed. "Vivienne, a lovely event." "Elena, wait," Julian said, stepping forward, ignoring the tightening of Vivienne's jaw. You look different. Where have you been? I heard you were working for Reed, but I assumed it was just what, Julian?" Marcus Reed stepped in, his hand possessively yet respectfully on the small of Elena's back. "Just helping out? No, Elena is the reason we've just signed the Carrington account. You know, the one your firm lost last Tuesday?" Julian's face went pale. The Carrington account had been his biggest failure since joining Sterling. Vivienne stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked Elena up and down. "So you're the little assistant who went rogue. How quaint." Elena didn't flinch. She leaned in slightly, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. "Not rogue, Vivienne, just independent. By the way, Julian, I noticed your latest filing on the Lockwood case. You used the Henderson precedent." Julian blinked, a flicker of pride returning to his eyes. "Yes, it's the anchor of the case." "It was," Elena whispered, just loud enough for Vivienne to hear. "But you forgot that the 2022 appellate ruling overrode it. You should have checked the updates I used to leave on your desk. Without me there to catch your mistakes, you're flying blind, aren't you?" She turned away before he could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of the ballroom as the color drained from his face, as Vivienne turned to him with a look of sharp, sudden suspicion. Elena felt Marcus's pulse beneath her hand as they walked toward the balcony. "That was brutal," Marcus murmured, his eyes full of admiration. "No," Elena said, looking out at the glittering lights of the city she finally felt she owned. That was just the first brick falling. The air in the Sterling and Associates boardroom was thick with the smell of expensive cologne and cold, clinical panic. Julian Forn sat at the mahogany table, his tie loosened for the first time in his professional life. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, threatening to ruin his Egyptian cotton collar. Across from him, Arthur Sterling, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from a mountain of granite, stared at a tablet. The screen displayed a headline from the Wall Street Journal that was currently erasing millions of dollars from the Sterling family's net worth. Lockwood merger shuttered. Sterling legal team misses critical appellate ruling. "Explain it to me, Julian," Arthur said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "Explain how a golden boy misses a 2022 ruling that was literally titled The Death of Henderson." Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked down at the legal brief he had presented with such flourish just weeks ago. It was a beautiful document, polished, rhythmic, and utterly wrong. He remembered Elena's voice at the gala, whispering into his ear like a prophecy. He had ignored her, thinking it was a desperate attempt to rattle him. I had my researchers look into it. The database must have flagged it as a minor procedural update." "Your researchers?" Vivienne Sterling leaned against the doorframe, her arms crossed. Her silver dress from the gala had been replaced by a sharp black power suit. Her eyes, once admiring of Julian's potential, were now flat and predatory. "You mean the interns you've been screaming at for 14 days? The ones you told to just make it sound like your old briefs?" Vivienne walked over and tossed a phone onto the table. It was a video of the morning's court proceedings. The judge was seen sighing as he dismissed Julian's argument in under 3 minutes, calling it antiquated and embarrassingly researched. "You weren't the brain, were you, Julian?" Vivienne asked, her voice cutting through the room. "You were just the megaphone, and without the person writing the script, you're just loud noise." "Vivienne, please." Julian reached for her hand, but she stepped back as if he were a leper. "I can fix this. I'll pull an all-nighter. I'll find a workaround." "It's too late," Arthur Sterling said, standing up. "The Carringtons left us this morning. The Lockwoods are suing us for malpractice, and Marcus Reed just announced that his new boutique firm, led by a Miss Elena Vance, has been retained to handle the restructuring." The name Elena Vance hit Julian like a physical blow. While the Sterling empire was leaking oil, Elena's office at Reed Capital was a sanctuary of quiet, focused power. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Hudson River, the water shimmering like hammered silver in the late afternoon sun. Elena sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over a keyboard. She wasn't editing someone else's work. She was drafting the future of 3 major corporations that had jumped ship from Sterling the moment the Lockwood scandal broke. Marcus knocked on the glass door, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water with lime. He set one on her desk. "You knew," his grin playing on his lips. "You knew when you mentioned that ruling to him at the gala that he wouldn't check it. You knew he'd be too arrogant to admit he didn't know what you were talking about." Elena took a sip of the water, the bubbles sharp on her tongue. "I spent 7 years learning the exact shape of Julian's ego, Marcus. I knew he'd spend the night after the gala drinking and telling himself I was just trying to get in his head. He spent so long believing his own hype that he forgot he never actually did the work." "The Sterlings are hemorrhaging," Marcus noted, leaning against the credenza. "Vivienne's father's looking for a scapegoat. They're going to burn Julian at the stake to save the firm's reputation." Elena looked at her reflection in the window. She didn't feel the rush of petty revenge she had expected. Instead, she felt a profound sense of clarity. For years, she had thought her value was tied to how well she could support Julian's weight. Now she realized that the weight had been her training. She was strong because she had been carrying him. He was weak because he had never learned to carry himself. A notification popped up on her screen, an internal memo from a contact at Sterling. "Julian Thorne, contract terminated, effective immediately." The golden boy was gone. "He's going to come here," Elena said quietly. "Should I have security bar the door?" Marcus asked. Elena shook her head, a cold, calm light in her eyes. "No, let him up. I want him to see what a helper looks like when she builds her own world." The sun began to set, painting the office in shades of deep orange and violet. Elena was finishing a report when she heard the commotion in the lobby. Julian's voice, once smooth and commanding, was now high-pitched and frayed. "I need to see her. It's urgent. She'll see me." A moment later, the heavy glass doors swung open. Julian stumbled in. He looked like a man who had been caught in a storm. His hair was a mess, his eyes were red-shot, and he was clutching a tattered leather briefcase, the one Elena bought him when he passed the bar. He stopped in the center of her office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the sleek furniture, the sophisticated tech, and finally at Elena. She was silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline, looking every bit like the queen of the high-stakes world he had just been exiled from. Elena, you have to help me." His voice cracked as he choked out the words. Julian stood in the center of the room, his shadow long and jagged against the polished floor. He looked around the office, his eyes landing on a framed photograph on Elena's shelf, not of a person, but of the patent filing for a proprietary algorithm she had developed for Reed Capital. "Elena," he said, moving toward her desk. He tried to soften his face, to find that old boyish charm that had once made her heart skip. "I've been such a fool. Vivienne, she didn't understand me. She didn't see the man I was when we were in that apartment in Queens. She only wanted the version of me she could show off at galas." Elena remained seated. She didn't lean back, nor did she lean in. She simply watched him, her face a mask of professional curiosity. "And what man was that, Julian? The one who told me I was his past?" Julian flinched, but he pressed on, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I said those things because I was scared. The pressure of that firm, the Sterlings, I felt like I had to shed everything to fit in. But I realize now that you were the only thing that was real. We were a team, Elena. We were the best in the city. Together we can fix the Lockwood mess. I have the files. If you just look over my shoulder one more time, we can show Arthur Sterling he made a mistake in firing me." He reached out to place his hand on her desk, his fingers trembling. "Marcus Reed is just using you to get at the Sterlings. But I know you. I know what we built. Help me get back on my feet, and we can start our own firm, just like we dreamed." Elena looked down at his hand, then up at his face. The desperation in his eyes was naked, but it wasn't born of love. It was the frantic clawing of a man who realized the pedestal he stood on was made of sand. "You're right about one thing, Julian," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "We were a team, but a team implies two people contributing. I was the architect, the builder, and the laborer. You were just the ribbon-cutting ceremony." She opened a sleek black leather folder on her desk. She didn't turn it toward him. She simply looked at the pages. "I've been auditing your work from the last 6 months. Without me to rewrite your briefs, your logic became circular. Your citations were sloppy. You weren't scared, Julian. You were lazy. You assumed that because I had made you look like a genius for 7 years, the genius had somehow rubbed off on you by osmosis. It hadn't." "Elena, please," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking. "I have nothing. The Sterlings blacklisted me. No top-tier firm will touch me after the Lockwood disaster. I'm broke. I've lost the apartment. If you don't give me a recommendation or a job here, I'm done." Elena stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the city where the lights were flickering on like 1,000 grounded stars. "When you left me in that apartment," she said, her back to him, "you told me you needed a woman who matched your future, not your past. You thought I was the anchor dragging you down. You never realized I was the only thing keeping you afloat." She turned to face him, her expression one of profound, quiet pity. "You didn't outgrow me, Julian. You just couldn't survive without me. And I am no longer in the business of keeping ghosts alive." "So that's it?" Julian's desperation turned to a flicker of his old, ugly arrogance. "You're just going to watch me drown after everything I did for you? I gave you a life. I gave you a purpose. You gave me a job, and I over-delivered. Consider my silence your final payment. I won't tell the world exactly how much of your career I authored, provided you leave this office and never contact me again." She pressed a button on her desk. "Security will see you out, Julian." Julian opened his mouth to shout, to rail against the unfairness of it all, but the sight of two large men entering the room silenced him. He looked small. For the first time in his life, he looked exactly as he was, a man who had sold his soul for a seat he didn't know how to sit in. He turned and walked out, his head bowed, his expensive briefcase bumping against his leg like a hollow weight. 6 months later. The morning sun flooded the boardroom of Reed and Vance. The name had been changed only a month prior, a testament to the fact that Elena wasn't just a consultant anymore. She was a partner. Elena sat at the head of the table, leading a briefing for a group of international investors. She spoke with a precision that commanded the room. There was no invisible worker here, only a woman who knew the value of every word she spoke. As the meeting broke, Marcus Reed lingered behind. He didn't stand over her, he sat in the chair beside her, offering a genuine, easy smile. The London group was impressed, Marcus said, handing her a tablet with the final signatures. They said they've never seen a strategy so airtight. That's because I don't leave room for leaks, Elena said, closing her laptop. I saw Julian yesterday, Marcus said tentatively. Elena paused. Oh, he's working as a document reviewer for a small traffic law firm in Staten Island, entry level. He looked tired. Elena felt a brief memory, the ramen, the hissing radiator, the way she used to hold her breath when he walked in the door. But the memory didn't hurt. It felt like a story she had read a long time ago about someone she no longer knew. He's exactly where his own talent took him, Elena said simply. Marcus watched her for a moment, his gaze softening. The gala for the children's hospital is tonight. I know you usually prefer to stay late and work, but I'd like you to go with me, not as a partner, as a person. Elena looked at Marcus. He didn't look at her as a helper or a project. He looked at her as an equal, a man who wasn't threatened by her light, but was warmed by it. She smiled, a real, radiant smile that reached her eyes. I'd like that, Marcus, but I'm picking the playlist for the drive. Deal, he laughed. As they walked out of the office together, Elena didn't look back at the skyline. She didn't need to check if the scaffolding was holding. She was the monument, and she was finally standing on her own ground.